My name is Brodie Swanson. I'm the executive pastor at Embrook Church. I've been a pastor for about 20 years. Started as a children's pastor into Next Gen Ministries. Now the executive pastor, I get to be a part of the teaching team. So get a lot of different opportunities to interact with people. And the question you've asked me is, how do I help people who are hurting? The first thing that I make sure that we do is that we listen, that I listen. People that are hurting want you to know their story. And the easiest thing for me to do is to jump in and make assumptions, make their story my story. There's a lot of different things that we can tend to do to fill in the blanks as humans so that we can get to the fixing of the problem before we actually hear where the person is at. And so I really try to listen and ask questions that would tell that person that I'm engaged with their story, that they have freedom to speak even if it's not the Christian line, that they have freedom to doubt God, question God, wrestle with God, struggle with God, and also struggle with all the other things around them. So listening is a huge part of that, and then really not trying to solve it, but to know my role. My role as a pastor is not to be a counseling expert. My role as a pastor is not to be a medical professional or to even be a reference for some of those things unless I'm asked. My goal is to help them understand where the presence of God fits into their circumstances. And so to do that, I take them back to Scripture many times. Psalm 28 and Psalm 91 are huge passages that I use about God being our strength and our shield, a very present help in time of trouble. And the word fortress is there. There's this protecting language that helps people understand that God is for them, He's with them. His goal is to protect His people and not to leave them exposed or vulnerable, which is what I feel like when I'm sick and when I'm dealing with stuff, is that I'm exposed, I'm vulnerable, I'm hanging out there on a limb by myself. And so if I can help people understand that God is a protecting God, not just a loving God, not just an all-knowing comforter and things like that, but that He's a protecting God is a big piece of what I can share with people, because that's something I can hang on to in the middle of the night when it's dark. And so listening, also going back to Scripture, but then consistency. And this goes back to something I learned from one of the pastors that I've worked with here at Embrook, is the power of presence. And there are places that I go and conversations that I walk into that there's nothing for me to say. I'm not smart enough or observant enough or experienced enough to be able to speak anything profound into that person, but I can sit with them and I can talk about sports and everyday life, and if they ask a question, I can answer it. But sometimes it's just sitting there and being with somebody in a room that God uses my awkward obedience in that moment to somehow make a difference. So that's how I approach it. New pastors, either when they're stepping in from the business world because they feel the call of God on their life and they sense pastoral giftings and they've found a place where they would like to engage those, or when they're coming out of seminary, I think our nature as humans is to try to fix stuff for people. And when you're dealing with somebody that's hurting, what's going to happen is always about process and not product. And so you're not trying to get to a certain product that they're feeling good about themselves, that they're able to smile, that they're happy. And that's going to be such a minuscule percentage of what the situation is about. It's more of the process of the journey that they're walking through, the story that God is writing on their lives. And so how do you step in and walk alongside them in that journey? And so you got to step in and resist the urge to be the expert, resist the urge to have all the answers, resist the urge to think you know all the nuances of their situation just because you've seen it or experienced it before. And so it goes back to what I said before, is listening is a huge key and presence is a huge key. And if you can get those two things down, that solves 90% of the breaks that happen when somebody's walking alongside another person. Where I see it go wrong is when pastors try to make it a 3-meeting issue where, hey, this person's got cancer, this person's dealing with the grief of the death of a loved one. And the pastor says, well, we've met 3 times and now you're really on your own. Check back with me if things are still going bad. I think we as pastors have to realize that a shepherd never waits for the sheep to come to them. So in the field, the shepherd is not sitting and going, okay, when the sheep's in trouble, it's going to come to me. The shepherd is constantly making the rounds saying, hey, where are the sheep? What kind of shape are they in? Are they hurting? Can I spot the problem before it gets to be a big problem? Can I head that off? Can I get in the middle of where trouble might be happening? And we as spiritual shepherds have that same role, is to constantly be out amongst the people. And for extroverts, that's a really easy thing to do because we love people and we love conversation. And it's really easy to dialogue in that place. For introverted people, that is a really big challenge, is to say, get out amongst the people, have conversation that starts at a surface level but has a chance of going deeper, and when it goes deeper, then we dig in. And so being able to constantly be in the midst of who we've been called to shepherd is a big deal. Making sure that we are observant and that we're listening, and then that we are consistently checking back, and that just takes discipline. And so those are the things. Now, if you were to ask me, now I'll go to the second question. If you were to ask me, if you're a new pastor, either coming from the marketplace or from seminary, coming into ministry, what are the things you need to keep in mind? And this may not be your question, and you may delete this, okay? I think there's a list of things. First of all, make sure that you're not going into the pastorate because you think it's an easy thing to do. Because being a pastor is a calling, and if it's your calling, then it takes all of the attention of your heart. And so it is like wearing your heart on your sleeve a little bit, because if you care deeply for the people, then it's going to take all of your heart's attention, and that will leave you depleted. And so in the middle of that, because it takes all of your heart and it needs to be a call, make sure you don't neglect your soul. And this is where the Bible talks about guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. And if you're going to be able to give life to other people, whether they're hurting or whether they're in a great place, then your heart has to be actually a wellspring of life instead of just a desert because you've neglected it. And so you need to keep that in mind, especially when working with hurting people, because it's hard to watch people hurt. I don't know. For me, it's really hard to watch people suffer. I'm a sympathetic crier. I'm a sympathetic throw-up person. When somebody else hurts, it affects me deeply, and that takes its toll. And so we got to watch our soul and make sure it's a call.
How do you cope with that? And sometimes, how do you deal with some of that?
I have built a support system around me of people that I go and talk to, colleagues that I go to, and I say, okay, here's the situation I sat in. How do you process that? Here's what I felt in that moment. Here's what I said in that moment. What would you say to me in that place? And then, as much as I hate it, there are times when I just need to be alone, and I need to be able to figure out, okay, what's going on inside my heart? If my internal temperature is up, there's that churning that you just can't identify. I need to figure out how to name it so that I know what's going on inside of me. Because if I know what's going on inside of me, then I'm much more able to help somebody else, because I'm not trying to address my issue by helping them with theirs, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And so I've built a group of guys that I can go to and have those conversations that aren't going to think that I'm an absolute loon because something's going on inside of me that I can't name. And so I would tell you that's a pretty big piece, is just to be able to say, if I'm going to guard my soul to help others, I need to find space. And so there's a whole list of other stuff, but I don't know if it's a question you want me to answer.
It's okay. No, good.
So, well, I would tell you, make sure it's a call. Make sure you guard your heart. Don't expect the church to be different than the business world. People walk in and they think that we call it wearing the rose-colored glasses, is that somehow when Jesus is in the middle, that everything's going to be hunky-dory and everybody's going to get along, and there's no territorialism, and there's no backbiting, there's no politics in the church, and yet we are human, and so all of our human foibles follow us into the church environment. And what we have to realize is that when we're walking into a church, is that it is both organization and organism. And if the organism is going to thrive, the organization has to give structure to those things so that there's not chaos, because in chaos, an organism will not grow and thrive. And so the organization is important, even though people don't want the church to be an organization. But the organism is the goal, as far as that goes. And then when you're stepping into the church, when you're stepping into the pastorate, and when you're helping hurting people, expect there to be spiritual warfare. I think that's one of the things I underestimated the most, was that apparently when I work in a church, then there's this hedge of protection around all those things. And yet I would tell you that when you work in a pastorate and you are speaking truth into people's lives from a platform that is many times respected, whether it's a main platform or the platform of your office, the enemy wants to discredit and to discourage and to disillusion, and he will go after your family, and he will go after your friends, and he will go after your mind, and he will go after your heart. And he uses all sorts of different things, but I would tell you he will use discouragement and division the most. He will try to make you feel like you are nothing, and he will try to divide the people that you need to be united with you and around you against each other, and those are two of his most potent weapons in spiritual warfare against pastors. And then if you're stepping into helping people or even just being a pastor, know that 90% of your job will be something they never teach you to do in seminary. There isn't a pastoral care course that can prepare you to sit next to a family when they're unplugging the life support machine. And there is nothing in this life that will prepare you for that holy moment when the heartbeat stops and reality meets eternity, and you know that a soul has passed from this world into the next. It's a sacred moment, it's a holy moment, and it's one that if you feel the need to speak into it, you will destroy a moment for a family that is profound. And so most of what we enter into in helping people, or even just in the pastorate, we never learn in seminary. We learn the theology, we learn the biblical content, which is very much the foundation of our role. But then the situations will differ so much from what we've ever been able to be taught that we just can't expect coming out of seminary, even because I went late to seminary while I was already in the pastorate, and I was totally doing things that I never learned in my classwork. And that's a huge thing to remember, because it makes you a learner continually instead of a person who's arrived.
No, definitely, and I love that you said all that. Definitely important. The other thing too, like how, what's the size? I mean, you guys are a mega church, as I consider, and were you said you've been a pastor for 20 years. Were you there when they started looking at separation of, or helping more distinction of pastoral roles, and also making sure having that support team to go minister or go listen to the congregation? Because the other thing is pastoral burnout. And some considerations of looking, when you're a smaller church, or if you even have 150 or 200 people, when it's okay, we need other people to help step in to allow the church to grow out, because the pastor can only do so much.
Right. I think my pastoral ministry started probably after they started to kind of build different dividing lines of ministry. So you had your youth ministry, and you had your children's ministry, and you had your adult ministry and things like that. Those things were kind of already in place in the megachurch when I stepped into the role, because I started in 1997, and so those things were kind of already built. But what I would tell you is that even though you have a large amount of pastors in those places, especially in a megachurch, we have 19 pastors on staff here for a congregation of about 5,000 on any given weekend. And what I would tell you is that there is no way for the pastors to help everyone. And that's why we have to teach people to pastor each other. And because once we live in a society that nowadays says, if you want the best care, you go to the expert. And as a parent, if I don't want my kids to take swim lessons or go swimming, we take them to swim lessons. And if they go and play soccer, they have a soccer coach. There's kind of this expert mentality, and unfortunately we've bought into that in the church. If we said, hey, I'm the expert, and it feels good for me to have the answers. It feels good for people to want to come and sit in my office and have the answers, because that kind of feeds me, but it also helps them. But the real care actually happens when I'm having a rough time, and the guy that I know that I have breakfast with once every other week or whatever figures it out, and he comes over and sits on my patio, and we just talk about it in the evening. And it's not because he's a pastor, it's because he cares, and he doesn't have tons of theological wisdom all the time, but he can look and say, hey, I don't think you're nuts, and I know this is hard, but you're going to make it through, and I know this and this about you. Let me call out and affirm those things. When we actually pastor each other, then we release the clergy from this burnout thing. Now, I will tell you, in the megachurch, we have a lot of resources available to us that many times smaller churches don't. I grew up in a church where we had about 110 people on Easter. So, that was our big day. The rest of the time it was 85 people. And our pastor was all the time going from house to house, and we called it visitation and things like that. And I mean, he was out a lot. And I would tell you that in some of those smaller churches, it's really easy for the people to say, well, he's the pastor, he needs to go to the hospital. He's the pastor, he needs to have the message. He's the pastor, he needs to take care of the leadership of this, that, and the other thing. And really, pastors will never avoid burnout if they can't do two things. First, they need to draw boundaries around their lives, knowing that you'll get up in the morning and somebody is going to be disappointed in you that day. And you just have to make sure it's probably not the same person 2 days in a row. And then the second thing is a pastor has to be a multiplier. He has to be able to say, how am I going to let people walk alongside of me, learn what I do, how I do it, and then they can speak into that so that they can go and maybe even do it better than I can. And if a pastor isn't a multiplier, he's always going to be a lone ranger, or she's always going to be a lone ranger, and then that's when you get into trouble, because you have Superman expectations that you can't possibly live up to.
Absolutely. And what about, like, even thinking about sabbaticals or stuff, for what do you hear? What have you experienced of how often, or what should?
It's a really great question. I just came off a 4-month sabbatical.
Nice.
I had 4 months this year from March until August. And I would tell you that sabbaticals are a really good thing. They're a super hard thing, because if you are a type A driven person in the pastorate, sitting still for 1, 2, 3, 4 months is extremely difficult. But what I would tell you is you will start to learn things at an experiential level about yourself that you may have never learned before. You would have known it theoretically, but you wouldn't have learned before. Let me explain. A few years ago, I got sick. I had jaw surgery. I got an infection that went down into my neck, and my throat swole up to where I couldn't swallow, but I could breathe. So my air pipe was open, but my swallow pipe was not. And we never can tell the difference. Like, if we're sitting here right now, you can't tell the difference between the two. But I could tell it then. And I would tell you that during sabbatical, what happens is that the difference between pastor and person, a difference that you probably can't feel most of the time because it's so enmeshed. The part of your role that you make decisions because you're a pastor, your calendar is dictated by the fact that you're a pastor, you exude certain behaviors because you're a pastor, because people expect that out of the role. Suddenly, when you're not a pastor and people are looking at you and you're looking at yourself as a person, you separate that role, suddenly you have to reconsider all of the things that were givens before and say, okay, as a pastor I would choose this, but as a person, is that really how I want my life to be? Is that really what I believe? Is that really how I would naturally act? And you have to engage with that at a new level, and when you do that, there's an awakening of your personhood that you actually can't put back in the box. And so what I found with me is that I had an awakening of what those things are, and as I've come back in, instead of going to an enmeshment again where I can't tell the difference, it's more like I can still feel my humanity over here, but I also am bound by some of my job requirements, but it's not the enmeshment where I can't tell the difference, and I can feel the difference in my heart and in my soul, and I can feel it in the way that I live each day. And I think that if people can get some rest and they can get the difference between pastor and person to a point where they're awakened to that, sabbatical is so beneficial for the church and for that person's family and for that person's own soul that it is a given that we should be doing that kind of thing. If the person's in senior leadership of an organization, though, especially one about the size of this one, with 5,000 attendees on a given weekend, I would tell you that 4 months is too long, and 4 months every 10 years, which is what I got, is probably not enough. And so I would tell you that shorter stints of 6 weeks every year and a half probably allows that compression that happens when we have the pressures of ministry to kind of come undone a little bit, and gives us a chance to come out from under the pressure and under the bar and get a little bit of rest before we go back in, and we can know a little bit of a different rhythm when we come back. So
yeah, I think that's very beneficial, very needed for the church.
We have 3 levels that we've talked about here, and I'll tell you, we're as imperfect as they come, because everybody hurts, and no type of hurt is the same. And so systems will always be imperfect. But one of the things that we do around here is we say, when somebody comes in and they have a need, they're having trouble in their marriage. It might be just a simple communication or a conflict issue or something, or even to a point where they've had a difficult diagnosis. The very first thing that should circle around them is their life group. the people that they're walking through life with, and we encourage everybody to be part of a life group. We're trying to get at least 60 to 70% of people meeting consistently with people who provide community for them. And that's your first line of defense. That's not the most knowledgeable necessarily, but it is the place where love and community and support happen best within relationship. And then once we figure out, hey, there's things that can't totally be helped in that environment, then we add a second layer, which is the pastors on staff here, some of the lay counselors and trained people in certain areas that would be in Embrook Church, that we have intentionally developed to help programs like Celebrate Recovery, where people can step in if they have an addiction problem that would be a part of the hurt, or if they've had some baggage from their childhood, where they can find groups that can help them in those things. That's where the second layer of the church happens. That's where that listening happens. That's where that connection happens. And then if we find that there's something even on top of that, where you run into things, and I'll just give a couple of examples, but it's by no means overarching. Clinical depression, anger issues that have gotten to a point where there's acting out, sexual addictions, all of these different things. When you get to those points, there's really not much that can happen within a small group that can help that, a life group. There's really very rarely someone on a church staff that can adequately understand and address those things. And so that's when we refer into the professional realm, and we intentionally develop networks, both of Christian counselors and secular counselors who have different expertise areas, so that when we get to that point where we're like, hey, we're going to walk alongside you as a pastor, and we're going to love you and spiritually engage with you, but we can't actually get to this level with you, then we try to make a connection here and say, this is where that issue might be able to get addressed, or this is where that hurt can really be probed a little bit deeper, and we're going to walk alongside you and love you, but this profession is going to have to be the one that's going to really help you, because we don't have the expertise to do that.
That's cool.
So it's kind of 3 levels.
And now just anything that you would like to say, anything encouragement to pastors, people, or both?
Mm-hmm. What you do matters. What you do for the kingdom matters. When you stand on a platform, or sit behind your desk, or sit around a table, or visit a hospital room, our job is obedience in the gifting that God has given us. Our job is to step in and listen to what God has to say, to show up in certain places and be a presence, and maybe just an obedient presence that God uses in ways that we can't imagine. That there are moments where we would step up and actually do something that He's asking us to do. But what you do as a pastor, what we do as a pastor, matters, not only for the present moment, but all the way into eternity. Don't underestimate the value of a small gesture, a small word, a small moment in the life of a person who's come to you with a need.
Yeah, and I think that's even the encouragement. I mean, sometimes we don't mean to. Sometimes we say something that might sound downer versus helping.
Well, and there's sometimes when I say something and somebody sitting right where you are hears something totally different, and they attribute to me some profound moment that I had nothing to do with, because I didn't actually say what they heard.
Yeah.
And God has done something in that midst. And so, I mean, it's really faithful obedience and doing what we can. So.
And anything I meant to ask too, like when a pastor is going through a hard time.
Yeah.
Anything that you suggest or recommend?
Get help. If you as a pastor are going through a hard time, the easiest thing to do is say, well, it's not that big of a deal, or I know what this is all about, or even the most dangerous thing is to say, my faith isn't strong enough. I need to just have stronger faith. Many times when we're going through a hard time, there's a reason for it. It's chemical, it's situational, it's life experience, maybe family of origin, and we just can't recognize it because we're too close. And so get a trusted voice, get a professional voice, get those voices of people smarter than you are into the conversation, so that you don't live in vagueness, or you just don't continue to perpetuate whatever issue is going on. Get help.